So we're on the eve of this momentous election, and on my podcast, which is called The Lost Debate, and on this YouTube feed, I've largely been saying the cliche of this election, which is this is 50-50. And at various points, I've said, you know what, I actually think Trump is favored in this election because of the right track, wrong track, because of traditional, like the comparisons of the polling this cycle compared to other cycles where Biden was up pretty significantly heading into this phase of the election compared to where Harris is now. There's a whole bunch of reasons. And I also have been saying that we can expect a long election period, perhaps like last time, many days. Last time we had to wait till Saturday for the results. But I actually think at this point, the most likely outcome is an election night call. And by election night, I mean like into the early morning, basically meaning that people are going to hear before their commute the next day who the winner is. That's what I think the most likely scenario is. And I actually think that this could be a pretty sizable victory for Harris. And so let me explain both of these things. Number one, we tend to get results on election night. With the exception of 2020 and 2000, we generally get a result or a strong sense of what the result is on election night. I think that's what's going to happen here, in part because there's just way fewer mail and absentee voting than there were in prior cycles. In a lot of these states, the votes cast prior to the election are actually traditional early vote, which are reported pretty fast. As the 538 has reported, if you look at state by state and the swing votes, we can expect a lot of these states to report pretty quickly. Georgia will be at 90% reporting by 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday. Michigan should finish by midnight. North Carolina will be at 98% by 1 a.m. Wednesday. Pennsylvania's largest counties may need to wait until Wednesday and Thursday to count. So Pennsylvania could be the one hanging out there. Arizona takes 10 to 13 days for absentee ballots. So the question is, will there be enough states here or a sizable enough margin in Pennsylvania and Arizona for this to be called? I think there's actually a fairly good reason to think that we could get a result. And I think it's because I think Harris is going to potentially overperform what a lot of the models are suggesting right now. So it's possible, I think, and very likely that she wins these sort of blue wall states plus many others. And there are a couple of indicators for this. I think number one has been, by all accounts, Trump has not closed strong. I think if you start with the Madison Square Garden rally up until today, he has been erratic to say the least. I don't really need to go into it here. He hasn't really been singing from the same song sheet as the rest of his campaign, which has been running rather on-message ads. And Trump has become the story. And if you look at any of the data, in both campaigns acknowledge this, any of the data, a lot of the independent voters who are undecided heading into the end of this election had serious misgivings about Trump. And 2-3 weeks ago, there was so much focus on Harris, and is Harris, does she have a clear message? Is she distancing herself from Biden, et cetera? But starting with that Madison Square Garden rally up until today, Trump has been the story in the news, and usually not in a positive way. And whenever he's talking, whenever the sort of sound bites are surfacing, it's not an on-message economic, inflation, immigration message. It's a series of erratic statements that are often reminding those undecided voters what they didn't like about him, which is why if you hear from people like David Plouffe from the Harris campaign and from a lot of the high-quality pollsters who've released polls over the past few days, most people are saying that the undecided voters are breaking Harris's way. And I think this is going to have effects across the board in these battleground states. And there are two particular states that stand out to me where we've gotten critical data over the past 24 hours or 48 hours. One is Iowa, which is a state we haven't really been talking about. But as you probably know, there's this poll from the Des Moines Register that's conducted by this woman named Ann Seltzer, who hasn't gotten a race wrong, a presidential race, since 2004, and has generally predicted within a point the results of presidential elections, even as a major outlier. So in previous cycles, and she often is an outlier with information inconvenient to Democrats. like she was in 2020 and 2016. It was often her polls that showed Trump overperforming that were a harbinger of things to come. And so not only do I actually think Iowa could be in play, and it's 6 electoral votes, but Iowa being a state that borders, for instance, Wisconsin, that seems to represent the Midwest, could be saying something about the larger electorate. And pollsters like Nate Silver, who are, or at least poll aggregators and analysts, are suggesting that perhaps what's going on that Seltzer is picking up is that the rest of the pollsters who've been polling the battleground states are hurting. They're basically cribbing off of each other's models so that they don't look bad, right? They basically don't want to deviate too much from the norm. But Seltzer has been willing to deviate from the norm. And actually other pollsters in non-battleground, traditional battleground states, like the Nebraska Nebraska electoral district around Omaha, the polling there has been way more favorable to Harris than Biden's margins were. Kansas, Ohio, you look at these states, Harris is wildly outperforming Biden's traditional performance. And what Seltzer is picking up is that older women, 60-plus women, are way more favorable to Harris than they've ever been in previous cycles. And those are the folks that vote. They turn up and vote in some of the highest numbers of any demographic group, perhaps the highest. And they're also the types who, and I had a conversation with a elected official in Iowa earlier today about this, who are not that public about how they believe, how they plan to vote. And this is why you see from the Harris campaign, they're kind of cringeworthy ads, but are like, with the Julia Roberts voiceover where a woman's at the polling booth and her husband's like, did you make the right choice? And she's like, I did, or whatever, right? And it's like, yeah, it's kind of cringe, but the campaign is running that ad for a reason. And Harris and Liz Cheney and others are voicing this idea that women are voting differently from their husbands, but also doing it so necessarily in secret. They're saying that because they believe this is a real dynamic at play. And so that could perhaps be the equivalent of the silent Trump voters in 2016 that the polling didn't pick up. It could be that there is this silent Harris vote. And I had been reluctant to believe this until recently, but I'm starting to believe it. Another state that honestly shocked me, I've been talking about John Ralston, who is the most sober and effective Nevada polling and election analyst out there, who has never gotten a race wrong, a presidential race in Nevada before. He had been analyzing early vote and mail vote in Nevada and been very sobering for the Harris campaign over the past few weeks. And I've been talking about this, how Ralston hasn't thought that Harris was getting good margins and historically good margins in the early and mail votes. And so he announced yesterday he was going to make a prediction this morning about where the race was going to stand. And I was damn sure he was going to come with a prediction that Trump was going to win Nevada based on all the analysis he's been doing up until now. But he shocked the world just maybe an hour or two ago by predicting Harris is going to win the state. And his analysis, I think, dovetails with what could be going on in other states. I would put Arizona to the side because I actually am bearish on Arizona, but North Carolina, Georgia, and the blue wall states, and maybe some shockers like Iowa, is that you have the traditional Democratic vote versus the traditional Republican vote. There's been so much talk of Trump eating into Harris's traditional voting blocks, black vote, and Latino vote, but actually a lot of the recent polling suggests that actually Harris has fought back effectively against Trump's incursions in those groups. There's a lot of analysis that since the MSG rally, Latinos are starting to stabilize at roughly the same levels that Biden got in the last election, which is devastating for Trump if true. But also that if you look at the black voters that are most likely to show up to the election, they actually tilt Harris in a way that very much resembles how Biden did, and perhaps she could even do better or close enough. But so that she's doing effective defense there. A lot could also be said of younger voters. But also that there are Nikki Haley voters that Harris has been consistently messaging towards, and regardless of what you think about Liz Cheney, that is obviously why Liz Cheney has been prominent in this campaign and why Harris has spent a lot of time with validators within the Republican Party and has made that a big part of her messaging, is because they think that those voters are up for grabs. And while Harris has been going after those voters, Trump has been doing very little to appeal to those voters. He hasn't been campaigning with Nikki Haley. He hasn't been having an inclusive message. His choice of the speakers and the message at Madison Square Garden is a perfect example of this. And so I think Harris is playing offense with those voters, which is why, for example, Trump at this late stage of the campaign is in North Carolina, and they've been investing heavily in North Carolina, a state that they should have no business having to worry about at this point in the race. Like, the Harris campaign not too long ago was pulling ads from North Carolina. Now they put more ads back into North Carolina, have been putting candidate time into that. Trump clearly thinks there's a problem in North Carolina, which means that he's starting to play defense, serious defense. So I think you put this all together, and I'm very bullish on Harris's chances. There's a graveyard of people who've made election predictions and have looked stupid. I can only share my conclusion here, which is based on all the logic of political campaigns. The two most important things, as David Plouffe, the chief strategist for Harris, has said, my former boss, the two most important things at the end here that can matter in a very close race are field. And nobody disputes that the Harris campaign has a much more robust field operation than Trump's team, who's largely outsourced it to Charlie Kirk and Elon Musk. You have field, which goes to Harris, and then you have the candidate discipline and attention. And as Tim Alberta has reported in The Atlantic yesterday, Trump, very ominously in that article, poo-pooed the idea of discipline being, mattering at all. Like, I think the quote was something like discipline, winning has nothing to do with discipline, or discipline has nothing to do with winning, which, if for you, those of you who are sports fans, like, could you imagine Bill Belichick or Nick Saban saying something like that? That is not what you want to hear from your candidate. And it dovetails with his behavior over the past 2 weeks, well beyond the past 2 weeks, but he's been particularly rough on the trail over the past 2 weeks. He has not been making good use of the limited time and attention that he has. He's been playing to small crowds. He's been erratic. He has seemed very defensive. He even attacked Ann Seltzer, the pollster, which just seems like a petty and weird use of time in the final stretch of this campaign. So all of this is to say that my final prediction here is a pretty sizable victory from Harris. So north of 280, I wouldn't be surprised if she got close to 300. I wouldn't be shocked if some unexpected states out there, like, yes, Iowa, went in her favor, and that this election would be called way earlier than people are expecting. That's my final prediction. You obviously can have your own. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, hit the like button, and you can throw in the comments your own predictions, and feel free to come at me over mine.